and hello to those joining us. This is another episode of Developers Let's Code, and this week we are focusing on the AWS CLI, the Amazon command line interface. Slight change to the lineup. I apologize for that. If you're expecting the SSH connection episode this week, we've moved things around a little bit, but we'll have that later on in our schedule. So hopefully you're just as happy to learn about the AWS CLI. So this show is focused on new to AWS developers. The whole idea is you've started with AWS, you're starting to get an idea of what all the services are, but you don't quite know how to use each of the services. So each week we will focus on a different area, such as storage, compute, different database technologies. And this week we'll be focusing on the AWS CLI, the Amazon command line interface. So first of all, greetings to all of you out there. I'd be interested to find out where you're all watching from. Fantastic. And let's kick off. So this episode is all about the command line interface. And the important thing to understand about the command line interface is that there's three ways to do everything in AWS. One is you can do things in the management console. Two is you can use the command line interface. And three, you can do things programmatically. So let's jump straight in and have a look what I mean by a lot of this. So I can jump into the EC2 management console. I've got the EC2 console here where I can see my EC2 instances. And I'm just going to use a feature in here called key pairs. And key pairs are the keys that you use to log into an EC2 instance. But I'm just going to use it to demonstrate the concept of doing things three different ways. So here in the key pairs console, I can say I would like to create a new key pair. I give it a name. Let's work that up a little bit. I'm going to just call this my console key pair. And I'm just going to say create the key pair. It then downloads for me the private half of the key pair. So demonstration number one, I just did something in the console. Let's have a look how you could do that in the command line interface. So in this case, I'm going to jump to my computer here, and I have the AWS CLI installed. And how many of you actually like using the AWS CLI? Say hello in chat if you like using the CLI. It's a great way to automate and script things. People typically start in the console, but they like to then move to the CLI if they want to automate a lot of processes. And I'll give you an example. I can come in here and say AWS to run the CLI, EC2 because I've got to choose a service that I want to run, and I know that there is a command called create key pair. And this will create a new key pair. I can then say, hey, I don't know what else to put in here. So I can say -- help, and it comes up, and just making sure it's good. Yep. AWS EC2 create key pair -- help is meant to come up and tell me, I need the key name. Why is that not coming up the way I expect? I can just type help. That's better. If I just type help afterwards, it will actually bring up the documentation for that CLI command, and I can come in here and see that it wants me to do a key name parameter. So I can come in and say, I would like to provide a key name. I'm going to call this the CLI. And in this case, demonstration number two, I'm creating a key pair through the AWS CLI. G'day, Brads. Good to have you online. If I come back to the console here and refresh, we now have the key pair that was created through the CLI. So I created one through the console. I created one through the command line here. And by the way, if you can't remember all these magical commands to type, I can come in here and say AWS EC2 create key pair. And if I don't know what else to type, I can type in CLI auto prompt. Not many people know about this. And it comes up and says, hey, you've got to enter a key name. So it will actually tell me which parameters I've got to put in there. So I can just say CLI2. It then says, do you want to do a dry run that says, test whether I'm allowed to do it, but don't actually do it? Do I want to provide some tags to that? It's an optional thing. Or I can just say, I'm done. Please run it. And it goes ahead. So CLI auto prompt is a great way to say, I've forgotten the parameters. Please tell it to me. And the third way you can do things is programmatically. So I'm on an EC2 instance here, and I have a little program written in Boto 3, which is the Python Yeah, Derek, I never knew about that one myself until recently. Here we have a Python program, and what it's doing is it's connecting to EC2, and it's creating a key pair called Python, and then it's just printing out that key for me. So if I give this a run, it's done exactly the same thing, and I come back into the console and refresh, and we see it has been created. So 3 different ways to do things. Console, great when you're new, when you want to do things and it leads you through how everything works. The CLI, great when you want to automate and script things. And third is programmatically when you want to do more complex things. So this week we will focus on the CLI. And in fact, this reminds me of a question that I saw in Stack Overflow just a few days ago. This person, whose name is Jamshade, is asking, I've got 3 instances in AWS. I have to start each by logging into the account, I think it means the console, and start it manually. I want to start it using Python just by running a script, and I don't want to log in and do it manually. How can I do it? And the answer is you can do it through the CLI very easily. So I came back and gave a little command here as another demonstration of the CLI. And the command here is AWS EC2. So always AWS is the command line interface. The service name is EC2. The command is start instances, and then you can specify some instance IDs. So let's give this a go. I will come back to my laptop here. I'll put in that command. And if I go to my EC2 console, I have a couple of instances that are stopped. So let's grab these instance IDs, put it on my command line. Got another one here. Grab the instance ID. So I'm now saying, please start these 2 instances by ID. It goes off. Now, it brings a whole lot of mysterious stuff on the screen. We'll be talking about this in a moment, but it's giving me information back about the instances, and it's saying the instances were stopped, and they're now pending. So if I go back to my EC2 console and refresh, you'll see they're pending and they're starting up. So another good example of being able to use the CLI. So let's jump into doing things with the CLI. By the way, I'm live. I'm broadcasting from Sydney, Australia, so happy to answer questions in chat. Or happy to say hi to any of you watching out here. And I'll try to teach you as much about the AWS CLI as you should know to get started within the hour. So if you are interested in the CLI and you go to this page, awsamazon.com/CLI, you can learn about the command line interface. You can download it from the side here. It's available as an installer for Mac and Windows and as a downloadable file and installer for Linux. And there's also a link to the documentation, and we'll be playing a bit with the documentation today as well. So to demonstrate a bit of an install, I have a brand new Linux instance that I just launched before the show. And let's log into this instance. I will grab I did not give it a public IP. I should give that no, it should have a public IP. Public. They just changed the console. Here it is. And I have everything's moved. So I will come in here and I have a shortcut to say, please log into that instance. So I'm on a brand new Amazon EC2 instance, and Amazon Linux 2 comes installed with the with the AWS CLI. So if you boot up an Amazon 2 Linux instance, it's there. You can use it straight off. Please note it's currently got CLI version 1 installed. We have released version 2, which has a few new interesting features. So I might quickly do that here. I can jump to the documentation page for installing the CLI. If you have your own computer, Mac or Windows, you can also download the installer and get it going. And it looks like what I need to do is go to my instance, download the installer, unzip it, and run the installer with the sudo command. Do you say sudo or sudo? I've never quite known whether to do sudo or sudo. And if I run AWS -- version now, it's not saying that I'm running that. Oh, still got my running on version 1. And I don't know, but hey, I'm not going to worry. Version 1 is good enough for me. Now, the next step to know about the CLI is when you run commands from the CLI, it sends the request to AWS as API calls. And to do that, you need credentials. So if I was to come in here, and I know there's a command in the CLI called S3 which says, please list my S3 buckets. And if I try this, it comes up and says, hey, you've got no credentials. So the first step you've got to do, Brad says sudo. Sudo makes more sense, but it sounds funny. Sudo. There are no credentials. So somehow you've got to give credentials to your AWS CLI. Now, if you're running on an EC2 instance, that's an easy thing to do. So here I've got my EC2 instance. I can come in and say, I would like to change my IAM role. So an IAM role can be associated with an EC2 instance. And I can just come in here and choose an IAM role. It associates to an EC2 instance. And through the magic of something called the EC2 instance metadata, it passes the credentials from that IAM role down to the EC2 instance. So if you're interested in knowing how it does it, it's using the instance metadata. But basically, I can now go in there and run the same command, and it comes up and lists all of my buckets. So if you're running on an EC2 instance, assign a role, and everything's fine. The second way that you can assign credentials is by getting an access key and a secret key and giving it to the CLI using the configure command. So I can pop into identity and access management. If you're watching a couple of weeks ago, we spoke about IAM for setting up security in your account. And I have a few users set up in here. And I have a user, I'm going to choose this one. It's called only assume let's code. I made it up earlier today, and it has limited permissions on it. And the way you get your access key is down here in the Security Credentials tab for your IAM user. So went to the IAM user, went to Security Credentials, and I can say create an access key. Now, the access key is like a username. It's okay for people to see that. So I will grab that. I will then come in here and say, I want to configure. AWS configure says, please store some credentials. And it says, what is your access key? So I'll give it my access key. Access keys for users typically start with AKIA. It then wants a secret key. And never show your secret key to anybody like I'm doing to you right now. And now I know it's okay because I've given no permissions to this user, so I know that you can't hack into my account, and I will delete it afterwards. But what I can do is I can grab this secret key. I can put it into here. It wants a region. I live in Sydney, so I'm going to say, please use the Sydney region by default. And there it is. So I can now call that thing, and it will override my credentials. So if I say AWS S3 LS, it's not going to actually work because that user that I just configured does not have permission to call S3. So there's a special order that things work in. AP South, I misspelled Southeast. I'm terribly sorry. AP Southeast 2. Let's try it again. And it says access denied, that's better. So, little hint there, if you ever get this error endpoint, make sure that you spell your region name correctly. It fools a lot of us. So, the CLI has a different way of looking for credentials. It will first of all look for any credentials you've hard-coded locally using the configure command, and then it will look for credentials from that IAM role assigned to the EC2 instance. And it stores the credentials in a .aws credentials file. If I go back to my home directory, AWS credentials, it stores those credentials in there. No use stealing my credentials, they don't have access to anything. So, AWS Configure is a great way to set up, to get your credentials set up. And what I can even do is, there's a command called AWS IAM get current user. And this command can normally be used to tell you who the user is you're running as. Now, oops, IAM get current user. Okay, I'll use another one, AWS STS get caller identity. They're basically the same. This won't work because my user does not have permission to use it. Oh, it did work. That's nice. It lets me do that anyway. So it's saying that I'm running on the user called only assume let's code. And so I can check which user I'm using when I'm making API calls out there. So I'll put that in the chat for you to know about. In the chat here. Good. So next magical thing that I want to show you today is profiles. Profiles are very interesting. So what if you have multiple users that you want to store in here? So I can see that I'm currently running as this only assume let's code role. I can create another user by saying AWS configure and give it a profile name. And I'll call this other user. I can then type in some credentials. I'll just type anything in here at the moment. And you saw before that I said, tell me who my current user is. It's this only assume let's code. If I was to run that command again and say -- profile, use the other credentials, this will fail because I didn't put real credentials in, but it's a way of saying, please use this other set of credentials. So you can have multiple users stored in your credentials file and use -- profile to choose which user you're using. So this is great if you have a production account, a test account, a dev account. You can just run the commands with different options. I'll give you an example. Here I am on my own computer at the moment, and I can say AWS S3 LS. And you'll notice I've got various files here. It starts with CloudFormation templates, fine. If I run that command again and I give it a profile, I've got another AWS account set up in my credentials called profile main, and you'll see it has a different list of buckets. So I'm literally connecting to a different account by using -- profile. Okay, let's do some more samples of what we can do with the AWS CLI. And the simplest ones are S3 commands. So let's actually look at the AWS CLI S3 documentation. A quick web search will reveal it for you. And for S3, we have a number of simplified commands that you can use to access things. So Brad's saying, can you assume a profile over multiple commands? So, interesting question. So what Brad is asking is, I created a profile over multiple commands. Every time you call the AWS command, you can specify a profile, but you've got to specify it every time. You can change your default profile. So in the credentials file, there is a default profile, and that's the one it will use if you don't specify anything else. So can you change the default? You've got to modify this file and put different credentials in that file to do it. So thanks for the question there, Brad. I thought you were asking, can you tell it to use the IAM role instead of the local credentials? And the answer is no. If it finds local credentials, it will use them before the role. So we've got some great commands here for S3. We've got the AWS S3 LS to list all of my buckets. I can also say, hey, I would like to list a particular bucket. So I can say, list me my Let's Code bucket. And it will list me the contents in there. I've got a picture of R2D2. I can also use the copy command. So I can say, I've got some files on my local machine here. I can say AWS S3 copy x.html to my Let's Code bucket. And if I list the contents of that bucket now, that file is now in there. So the CP command, similar to Linux commands, will let you copy a file to S3, from S3 down to your machine, or even between S3 buckets. So I could now say, hey, AWS S3 copy my Let's Code bucket let's do R2D2 PNG to another bucket that I've got called JStackA. It's just a random name I have. And I've now copied files between my S3 buckets. It doesn't involve download, upload. It automatically happens between S3. So some very useful commands. I can even say AWS S3 create a bucket, make bucket. And the name is going to be Let's Code 2. and I now have a bucket successfully created. So very simple to run commands in there. Let's go to some more complex commands. Let's say I want to list my EC2 instances. So there is a command called describe instances. AWS CLI describe instances. Let's look at the documentation. And you'll see here, I've just got to say AWS EC2 describe instances, and that's all you need to provide. It will bring back information about all my instances. Now, there's an auto-complete also available in the CLI. Let's see if I can get it going. If I run, I'm in a Z shell, so I can't do it. There is an auto-completer available for the CLI, which runs in certain shells. So let's try this now. If I say AWS EC2 describe, it's now saying, what do you want? And I hit in tab. Oh, I want describe instances. So an auto-completer, which is very handy there. So describe instances, and then bang, it's providing me back a whole lot of information about my instances. Now this can be quite confusing because I don't care about my VPC ID or my interface type or my source destination check. I'm just interested in getting back, let's say, my instance ID. So please give me a list of my instance IDs. So how can we do this? I'm going to run that command again and go to the very top, and you'll see that it comes back with a list of information starting with reservations. A reservation is when you launch multiple instances at once. Let's say you want to launch 3 EC2 instances at once. That's one reservation, but 3 instances. So it brings back the reservations, within which it brings back instances, and inside of that, it's bringing me back my instance type. And this is the real power of the CLI. I can now come in here and say, I would like to run that same command, but please give me specific information back. Please go into the reservations, all of them. Please go into the instances, all of them, and please give me my instance ID. And now when I run this command, it just brings back those selected fields. So in SQL, this is a bit like the select statement. When you say select and you choose which columns you want back from your database, this is choosing those columns. So I can come back and I've now got a list of my instances. And this is coming back in JSON format. I can change the format that things come back in. I can run that command and say, please output in the table format, which might be a little bit more friendly for you to read on screen. Or I can come in and say, I would like to output in text format. And here's a little hint for you. Sometimes it prints the results as tab delimited. And what you can do to avoid that is, a little trick here, if you put the field of interest in square brackets, let me make my window wider so you can see that. I've put my field name in brackets. When I run this, it will actually return it 1 per line. So a little tip for you. This is very useful if you want to capture some output and use it in another command, and I'll show you that very shortly. And there is a new option in the AWS CLI version 2 where you can output as YAML, which can be quite useful too. So the query command is all about choosing which field you want to get out. You can choose multiple fields as well. Is the Xneolio80 says, is the query structure analogous to JQ? So let's talk about the format. So the answer is yes. And there exists a thing called James path. So one of the creators of the AWS CLI is a fellow called James Sayawini, and you'll see him on a lot of AWS YouTube videos. So if I say YouTube, AWS reInvent for the CLI, and pretty much every CLI video you'll see from reInvent on YouTube has James as one of the creators. James Sayawini, that's him here. And as one of the creators of the AWS CLI, he wanted a way to specify the path to extract that information. So he created this thing called James path. Guess what? His name is James. And he also created, I believe, JQ, or somebody else might have, but it also uses James path. And James path is amazing. You can come in, and here's an example with EC2. So as I just did, I went through the reservations, I went through the instances, You can even say, retrieve for me the tag values. So find me tags where the key is name and return the values. And show me the state of the machine. Let me see if I can use that on mine. AWS EC2 describe instances, query, paste in what he had. He didn't have capital letters. Instances, tags, value, state, name. I don't know what type is. Let's give this a go. Okay, it almost worked, but I think tags has to be capitals. And that didn't quite work. I'll have to check that out later. Instances, tags. A good way of checking it is when you look at the documentation, AWS CLI, describe instances. I always like looking at the sample output in the documentation. So here it is, and it's saying we have this thing called tags, the capital T. One last try before I give up. Key values, I don't know why that isn't working, so I'll ignore that for the moment. But you can specify multiple things. Let's give another example here. I'm going to give, the state name was good, the running thing there. So let's go back to my earlier command. I wanted to show the instance ID. I will also show the state.name. So when I run this now, it should show me the instance and whether or not each instance is running. It's giving me the state. So very powerful. Query lets you say which fields you want to have output. If you're interested in learning more about it, I highly recommend you check out the James Path examples, and there is a James Path tutorial, which is also really good. And it's an interactive tutorial where you can go through and try things. So if I look for instances here, he's giving an example here where you have reservations instances, and I can change this and say, I only want to see the first instance, and as I type that, it comes back with the information. So a great way to debug and test your James Path expression. Okay, so query tells you which fields you want. Let's say I am interested in listing only my Windows instances here. And a little trick here, I can find my Windows instances with a little command. Let me try this one here. So, no, that's not what I want. I will look for Windows, describe instances. Windows is the platform key. So let's give it a go here. So in the output, there is a field called platform. It's all going to make sense in a moment. EC2 describe instances. I'll give you an idea here. We have a field called platform, and the documentation says if it's Windows, it shows as Windows. If it's Linux, it's actually a blank field. And that platform is inside the instances command. So I'm going to come in here and query the, what do we have? We have the reservations instances. Now I want to show the instance ID and the platform. So we can see that some of them are coming back with Windows and some of them are not. So how can I only list the ones that are Windows? And for that, I'm going to use an additional command here, which is called the filter command. So if you're using SQL, filter is like using a where statement, where you can say, I only want to retrieve certain values. And the documentation explains how to use the filters command. And it has lots of things you can filter on based upon the command you're using. So I could do it based on availability zone, DNS name, the AMI that I launched with, etc. But I'm going to go for the platform. So I can come in here and say, I want to use filters, and the syntax is a little bit funny. The name of the filter is platform, and the values that I'm interested in getting back is Windows. So this should only show me the instances which were Windows. And indeed it did. It came back with just the ID number for just the rows of my instances that are Windows. So that's the filter command to limit what's coming back. Now, let's see how you can use this in a very interesting way. And that is, what if I want to combine together commands? So I might want to say, hey, I've got some EC2 instances, and I've got an EC2 instance. One of them I have stuck a particular tag on, if I can find it. And here it is. I have a tag called Stopinator, which is commonly used to start and stop instances. And if I want to find these instances based on that tag, I can run a command a little bit like this. So I've got describe instances filter, where the tag name is Stopinator and the values is stop. So if I run this command, it comes back with my instance ID. What if I want to start or stop that instance? How can I take the output of this command and put it in another one? And what I can actually do is I can say, hey, I would like to store the output of that command into an environment variable. And I'm going to say, please output it as text, because I don't need all the quotes and funny things that are coming around that. So if I run this command, it will store that particular instance ID in an environment variable. And I can now use that environment variable for another task. For example, I might want to stop the instance. So I can say AWS EC2 stop instances, and I think it needs instance IDs. And I can just say, insert that variable in there. And what it's doing now is it's going to stop that instance that I found by a tag. So you can combine things together that way. Run one command to retrieve a value and pass that command into another command. Have any of you ever done something like that? It's a slightly more advanced AWS CLI thing. I would also love to hear your common use cases. What do you typically use the CLI for? Do you store commands that you quickly want to run? Do you query things? A lot of advanced users tend to say that they start by using the console, but once they're really working, they use the CLI to do most things, because it's a great way to do repeatable commands. Someone's saying I look like Bill Gates. You should have seen me when I was younger, and I really looked like Bill Gates when I was younger. Bill's looking a little bit older now, so hopefully I don't look like Bill today. But thank you for the feedback. So let's have a look at another example. SQS. Don't know if many of you have used the Amazon Simple Queuing service. This is a highly scalable service where you can create queues, send messages into a queue, and retrieve things from a queue. Now, I don't currently have any queues defined in my SQS service, and let's create one. So I can create one. Instead of doing it from the console, I'll do it here. AWS SQS is the service that I'm wanting to do. I know the command is create queue because I looked it up earlier. Let's use CLI auto prompt because I can't remember what else it wants to know from me. It wants a queue name. So let's call this let's code. I'm done. Please run the command. So it has now created an SQS queue for me. And if I refresh the console, good, there it is. So I have my let's code queue created. And let's say I want to send a message to the queue. AWS CLI send message for SQS. If we look at the documentation for sending a message, it wants a queue URL in here. Xnilo is saying, I work with the AWS GovCloud and secret regions and use the CLI all the time since they're slow on those networks. Very true. The console can be a little slow, click, click, click. If you've got commands you often use all the time, use the CLI. It works very nicely. Here's a little bit of information for you. In the early days of AWS, there was no management console. If you want to use AWS, you used to have to write a program and call the APIs directly. The CLI is actually a Python program that calls the Python CLI to do things. So before the console existed, you could still do things programmatically. A lot of people prefer doing that too. So I want to send a message to my SQS queue. It needs this thing called a queue URL. I don't know my queue URL because, here it is. It came back when I created a command. So let's try something like I did before. Let's say that my queue equals the output of this command. I'm going to give it a queue name or create a new queue. Let's call this Let's2. And I have my queue name now stored up in my queue. Fantastic. I didn't output text. Let's create Let's3 output text. Why is the network slow in those particular regions? I don't know. I live in Sydney, and to me, the whole internet is always slow. So not sure why some regions might be faster than others. It might be a distance from those things. If I echo queue, here is my queue URL for my Let's Code 3, and I might send a message, AWS SQS send tab message, queue URL queue, and I think I've got to provide a message, hit tab, a message body. So I have now sent a message. So you can use the AWS CLI for all different services, S3, EC2, SQS. Basically, every service you can use through the console, through the CLI, or programmatically. And some services, you can't even do everything through the console. You've got to do it programmatically or through the CLI. And if I go back to my SQS queue here and do a refresh, we can see that I've got my additional queues. If I go into my Let's3 queue, I can hopefully see messages. If I poll for messages, here I have a message, and it is indeed my hello from Let's Code. So everything via the CLI. You don't have to do things through the console. You can do it through the CLI. And it's a great way of doing things. If you're not a programmer and you don't necessarily want to write a script every time, the CLI can be a really great way to send all of those commands out there. While I'm thinking about it, sometimes people say to me, does this work for Windows? And yes, you can get the AWS CLI for Windows, but a lot of people also like using pure PowerShell. So instead of using the CLI, you might want to download the AWS tools for PowerShell. And it's a more PowerShell type of syntax you can use to use a lot of AWS services. Let's see if we've got S3 listed in here. S3. Let's get an object. I'm not a big user here. So okay, so here is a get command, for example. So get S3 object, and it has similar parameters to what you'd use in the CLI, but it is a more PowerShell type of syntax. Okay, any questions out there about the CLI? Or I'll keep doing a few more demonstrations. Let me know out there. Now, something I wanted to do was assume role. Sometimes you want to use services in a different AWS account or with different levels of permissions. So I assigned, here is my EC2 instance. I assigned an IAM role to this instance, but then I overrode it by giving it an IAM user. Now, this IAM user themselves don't have permission to access S3. So let's give that a go. Whoops. Connect back in, AWS S3 LS. This user does not have permission to access S3. However, they have been given permission to assume a role. Let's have a look at this. My IAM user that I'm using on that instance has been given some permissions, and the permissions they've been given access to is they're allowed to assume a role in my account called view let's code bucket. And that role does have permission to use S3. So let's have a look at how you can assume a role and get access to my S3 bucket. Now, you could manually assume a role if you wish. So the way it works in AWS, I should bring up the documentation and show you. AWS assume role STS. This is a bit of an advanced concept, but it's well worth understanding. Normally, an IAM user only has a certain set of permissions that you've been given. However, you might want to temporarily assume greater permissions. It might be permissions in a different account. It might be administrative permissions. It might be permissions to let you access a service that you don't normally want to use. So assume role gives you the chance to temporarily take on additional access. It sort of replaces your access. And you've got to call this assume role command. So let's see in the AWS CLI how I would assume a role. And it's saying I've got the assume role command. And let's give it a go. AWS STS, standing for Security Token Service, assume role. It then wants me to provide the ARN, the Amazon resource name of the role that I want to assume. And the role that I want to assume is this one here, called the View Let's Code bucket. So I can paste that in. Let's go back to the documentation. It wants a session name just to refer to. So I'll call this my show. And it returns a whole lot of credentials. I'm not worried about you seeing these credentials because I know that it only has read-only access on one bucket, but normally do not show these credentials to anyone. So one way of accessing the role is I could grab these credentials and I can say, hey, AWS configure profile, I'll call it my bucket. And I can put in these particular credentials. There is also this third thing that comes back called a session token, and the configure command does not actually take the session token, so I'm just going to add that in myself. Again, never show credentials. I've checked that all my credentials are safe. I need a AWS, what is the token? AWS credentials file token. I've forgotten the syntax. AWS session token is what it's called. Session token equals this big long token. Fantastic. So now, if I AWS S3 LS with my default user I can't access, but if I use the profile of the one I just created called bucket, it is not working. And because I didn't tell it which bucket I want to list. Let's start again. AWS S3 LS S3, my bucket is called live demos, folks, live demos. My bucket is called Let's Code Bucket. Let's Code Bucket. This will fail with my default credentials, but it should work with my credentials I got back from assume role. But that was a mess. That was really hard. I had to call assume role, provide all the information, get the things back, configure some new credentials, hop in the editor. It was all too messy. Fortunately, the AWS CLI makes it even easier for you to do this. And that is by putting the profile directly in the configurations file. And the way you can do that, just look at my cheat sheet. Excellent. So I can use something here called AWS Configure Wizard. And the AWS Configure Wizard says, hey, what do you want to do? Do you want to put in static credentials or do you want to assume a role? And I can say, oh, I'd like to assume a role, please. It says, what's the name of that role? So if I go into my IAM, the role is called Let's Code Bucket. Oops, I'm going to stop this because I forgot to say I want to create a profile. Please configure for the profile called assume it. Assume a role. It's called View Let's Code Bucket is the role name. And okay. Let's try it without that. Assume a role. Give it that profile. and it's saying I'm not allowed to assume it. And that's because I'm doing it on my machine. No, I'm doing it on that machine. Best laid things. Let's debug here. It's saying I'm not authorized to perform list roles. That's correct. So I am going to have to do this the manual way. Sorry folks, I should have tested this before. Here I have my lovely configuration file. Let's clean it up a little bit. I'm going to add a new profile called assume it, because I didn't have enough permissions in that role to list my roles. The wizard option is there from the very beginning. It's amazing what you can discover if you watch those AWS reInvent videos and discover all of these hidden commands that you didn't know were in there. So even the AWS CLI version 1 has that configure command. All I've got to say here is role. I've got to put an entry in here called role ARN equals, go back to my IAM role, put it in here, and there's one more thing you need in here when you use the role ARN, and that is you've got to tell it the source profile, and I'll explain what this is. To call assume role, you have to have some credentials so that it can verify that you are allowed to call assume role. And in this case, I'm going to use the default profile to call the assume role. But all I have to do is put in those couple of lines that say the role I want to assume is that thing. So hopefully now I can just say AWS S3 LS, my bucket, which I had here before, using my profile called assume, fingers crossed. I've got the wrong syntax for my profile command. Profile assume. Profile assume. I'm going to let it create that. Last chance before I give up. There is my profile assume. Oops, wrong command. List. Using that profile, please. And it couldn't be found because I didn't put it in my config. Sorry about this, folks. I have been manually editing buckets. Fingers crossed, wrong command, dying here, dying. I want to list buckets using assume profile, and it worked, phew. So quick recap what I did there. So I created a profile called assume that simply pointed to a role, and it said use my default credentials to get into it. And on the command line, I simply said, use that profile. It automatically assumed the role, got the credentials, used those credentials to list the bucket and return me back to normal. So a much simpler operation when wanting to assume those credentials. So some great things you can do within the configuration bucket, and it's all there in the documentation. Ro is asking, can assume role be used for RDS cross-account without having to worry about private VPC of destinations? How can you use more than one role assigned in an EC2? Okay, so let's try and pull this apart. Can an assume role be used for RDS? So let's say there is a role that has permission to access RDS. I could assume that role and then use those return credentials to talk to RDS, such as stopping and starting the database instance. So yes, can certainly do that. Can it be done cross-account? Yes, assume role can be used cross-account. In fact, it's the best way to do cross-account access. When you create an IAM role, you've got to make sure that you have a trust policy that says who you trust. So in this case, I have a role created in my account, and it's basically trusting my account. You can add additional values in here to say that you are willing to trust another account. So let's say I'm running an account A. I want to run interface with RDS in account B, I would create an IAM role in account B that trusts account A so that I can assume the role in account B and then use it. Without worrying about private VPC of destinations. So public-private VPCs are used to connect to your resources like EC2, RDS, Redshift. They're not really used for connecting to the API endpoint in AWS. So when you're making API calls like this, you normally want to connect to the internet or use a VPC endpoint within a VPC to get out to the internet. So roles don't really have anything to do with public-private subnets. How can I use more than one role to be assigned on an EC2? So if you're talking about the roles that are assigned to an EC2 instance, this is very interesting. So people sometimes run multiple applications on an EC2 instance, and they want to say, I want application A to have role A, and I want application 2 to have role B. And the simple answer is you can't. When you come in here and you say you want to associate an IAM role with the instance, you only can choose one IAM role. So if you want to have multiple applications with their own roles, they will need to separately call the assume role command and use the credentials that are provided back. And to call the assume role command, they will need a set of credentials such as a role. Does anyone out there know whether you can call the assume role on credentials that have been assumed? Not sure if you can call the assume role with temporary credentials, but you might need an IAM user to call it, or you use the role that is assigned to the instance to then make another assume role call. Nice and confusing, eh? So that's the main bits that I wanted to explain to you about the AWS CLI. So if you are interested in learning more, I certainly recommend visiting those AWS reInvent CLI videos. They go back as many years as you can imagine, 2019, 2013. This was actually a pretty good episode. A great way to pull out some really interesting information, such as that CLI auto prompt and the wizards in there. The CLI version 2 has some interesting additional capabilities. I think I have a reference here. I'll put this in the chat. So some of the interesting things that CLI version 2 gives you is it can use our single sign-on. So if you have your users authenticating to a single sign-on service rather than using credentials, it can now support the SSO service. You have the completer where you can type in, I want to find these services, but the CLI version 2 goes further. It even allows you to complete things like DynamoDB table names or security group IDs. I have it installed on my machine here. I'll give you an idea. I can say AWS EC2 Describe Security Group. I'll just hit tab and see. It's Describe Security Groups. Let's do I can put in the Describe Security Groups, AWS CLI Describe Security Groups, and it wants to know a field called group IDs. That's what I was looking for. Group IDs, or group names even. Group names. And now if I hit tab, it will actually go off and list me my actual security group names that I can go in there and fill in. Or I could say security group IDs, and if I hit tab, it will autofill my security group IDs in here. So I can say, oh, I'll take the one with 4C, thank you very much. So it can go off and do a list of those resources and paste it in for you. So that's a really nice feature. And where was I? Too many tabs. I will go back to the link. So other things that the CLI version 2 can do for you, you've got that CLI auto prompt, but that was in version 1, I think. Automatic filling in, and it works for things like, oh, there are also wizards. So you can put in wizards in there and say, oh, I would like to create a DynamoDB table, and it will take you step by step and ask you the questions for creating that table. So rather than just prompting with these strange dash commands, it will ask you words in English saying what values do you want to choose for this, and it has pull downs in there. So let's give that a quick go. AWS DynamoDB Wizard for new table. It then says, what's my table going to be? What's the primary key? Oh, is it going to be a string or a number? So it's coming back quite nicely. Do I want to add a sort key? No. Let's go on demand. I'm not going to use encryption, and bang, it runs the command for me. So really a nice way of provisioning things through a simpler wizard. So I check the documentation for each of them. So we're on the hour, so I just want to say thank you for that, joining me on that whirlwind tour of the AWS CLI. Coming up next week, as opposed to what is listed on here, we've got things slightly different. We'll be talking about, so next week on the 23rd, we'll be talking about creating a WordPress website on Amazon Lightsail. So Amazon Lightsail is our virtual private server service. It's like a mini AWS. If AWS is too confusing and you really just want to deploy a WordPress server or a website or something simple, Amazon Lightsail is much easier to do, simple to deploy, simpler pricing, and we'll go through a lot of that next week. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next week on Let's Code. Thank you very much.